jinxed it, Pippa, who had been glancing around, keeping a good view of the room at all time, suddenly reprimanded. Everyone else turned to see what she was talking about. And indeed, as if on cue, Sheeta had just entered the casino. She stood a short bit from the entrance for a moment, seemingly glancing around the filled tables and pondering something. Then, after a while, she seemed like she was about to turn right around again. But, similar to what Fither had done with him before, James brought two of his fingers to his lips and let out a loud, sharp whistle. The room seemed to become quiet for a moment, as his company looked at him, mouths agape. Sheeta's ears twitched a bit in his direction before she turned to look at him, seemingly unsure if the sound was meant for her. James grinned wide, ignoring the confused and concerned glances of the people surrounding him, and beckoned to Sheeta with one finger. Sheeta incredulously eyed the group, sitting at the table with him for a while, before shrugging and baring her teeth back at him, which he knew was her way of trying and failing to grin as well, but which also seemed to absolutely freak out everyone at the table. Sheeta quickly gestured towards the counters with her thumb, to which James nodded before she turned her back away from him and walked off. With wide eyes and pinpoint pupils, Cliff leaned towards James and agitatedly shouted, "What is that about now? I thought you two talked things out." Next to him, Pippa began to look like she had just seen a ghost, and if she was a human, she would probably have been pale as one too. "I don't know about this, James," she quietly spoke up. "You two didn't seem exactly thrilled to see each other. Why'd you call her over in the first place?" Fither contained her emotions better than the other two, trying to look more curious than nervous. But James could still tell she too was very unsure of the situation. He just shrugged, feigning ignorance as to why they all seemed so nervous. Why not? It didn't look like she wanted to sit anywhere else. "So I thought she might as well sit with us," he answered nonchalantly. "And if she didn't like to see me, would she really be coming over?" That apparently got everyone thinking. Looking over at each other, they seemed to quietly assess their situation. Interestingly, the looming new threat apparently made Pippa instantly warm up towards her carnivorous company, who she had still been eyeing nervously before. None of them seemed too keen on being around should it actually come to blows between the two deathworlders, a scenario that they seemed all but sure of at this point. But they apparently also did not, either for the sake of not appearing rude or, maybe, because they didn't want to leave James to face the supposed consequences of his actions alone. Or maybe their curiosity had overcome their fear at that point, and they wanted to see how this would end. So they sat with him, exchanging worried glances among each other, even as Sheeta was walking over towards them, looking them up and down while walking. With one big bound, she effortlessly jumped onto the table, landing right between Fither and James, her tray not even as much as shaking in the process. "Show off," James mumbled amusedly, as Sheeta began to sink down next to him. "Shut up, you," she retorted, lightly nudging him with the back of her head. "Hi, Sheeta." Cliff was the first to speak up. "How are you doing today?" Sheeta looked up at him, eyeing him up and down confusedly, as if not quite sure how to react to what he had just said. "I'm fine. Thanks, I guess." She replied slowly, and stalking at the end. "Oh, call me Cliff. We've met each other on the bridge a while ago," he explained a bit too quickly. "Yeah, I know that," Sheeta said defensively. James could see if he didn't do something about it, things would get real awkward, real fast. Well, it seems you don't have to be introduced. Like, ever, James said, addressing Sheeta directly and snickering. But these two lovely people also gracing us with their presence are Fither and Pippa. Ah, he pointed at each of them while introducing them. Pippa gently waved, her ears perking up curiously as he introduced her. Fither once again angled her head inquisitively and gave a small nod. Petty Officer Sheeta, the addressed, introduced herself, despite everyone already knowing who she was. Everyone was looking first at her, and then at James for a while, which wasn't really helping the awkwardness of the situation. James once again pointed over to Fither and explained gleefully, "Fither, there was actually the medic who stitched me up after our first run-in with each other." Sheeta looked the woman up and down, seemingly pondering something. "Sorry about that. I don't usually let people clean up after myself," she apologized, lowering her head a bit, while also keeping eye contact. "Don't mention it. It is my job after all." Fither waved off her statement, although I do have to admit it was quite the spectacle to just sew a wound like that shut like it was a torn bag. She proudly ruffled her feathers a bit. "I told you. On Earth, that is completely normal," James interjected. "It was still quite an experience," Fither retorted quaintly. "You have to remember, saying, 'It is normal on a death world,' is kind of an oxymoron in itself." James shrugged dismissively and sighed, before taking a big bite off a large fruit that smelled like fake red berry aroma, which he had brought for dessert. Sheeta sniffed the air and leaned over to him, looking curiously at the juicy fruit in his hand. "What's he got there?" she asked nosily. James moved the thing a bit away, in order to keep her nose out of his food, while also looking at the sweet treat in his hand. And it was very, very sweet. "Truthfully," he answered, "I have absolutely no idea. It's just some fruit." "Ooh, can I try?" Sheeta asked, leaning even further towards it, thoroughly invading his personal space and causing him to extend his arm even further away. "What? Why?" he blurted out, smiling while she was almost climbing over him to reach his hand. "I don't think you would like it. I'm not even quite sure if you could taste it." In the back of his mind, he remembered something about felines not having taste buds for sweet tastes. "Well, I can still try it," Sheeta retorted, by now forcing James to physically lean back away from her, causing Pippa to quickly step away in order to not get caught up in whatever was happening. And with one final push of the two of them, they lost, tipping over, James landing flat on his back, with Sheeta crouching on top of him, still reaching for the fruit. James couldn't help but burst out laughing. "Okay, fine. Wing. It's your stomach you're upsetting," he laughed, finally handing her the fruit, while also pushing her off of him. Sheeta looked very satisfied with herself, while triumphantly holding the big crop in both hands, her tail waving from side to side, excitedly, still chuckling. James struggled back into an upright position, taking a deep breath once he had managed to sit up again. Then his laughing faded, when he, while looking around the table, realized that everybody else looked not any longer concerned, but absolutely mortified. Pippa had not, as he had thought, only taken a step back from the two of them wrangling with each other. but had instead walked a good bit away from the table, now eyeing him jitterily. On the other side of the table, Fither and Cliff were tensely looking back and forth between him and Sheeta. Cliff had apparently been in the middle of getting up and was only slowly sitting back down, with Fither pulling his arm, seemingly trying to either calm him down or hold him back. Still eyeing them confusedly, James asked, "Huh? What's up with you guys?" causing Sheeta to shift her attention away from the fruit and towards the people at the table as well. Cliff and Fither exchanged a quick glance before Fither softly answered, "We were about to ask you the same thing." "Yeah, what was that just now?" "There's plenty of food. You don't have to fight over it." Cliff continued upset. What? Did it look like we were fighting to you?" James asked as if the mere thought was absurd. The looks he got as answers, however, showed him how sorely mistaken he was. Everyone seemed very sure that it did indeed look like they were fighting, although he couldn't quite believe it. "We weren't fighting. Just roughhousing a bit," James explained, trying to diffuse the situation by adding a bit of humor to his voice. "Don't tell me that little scuffle actually scared you." Cliff and Pippa did not seem at all convinced, but Fither quickly interjected in an almost appalled tone. "Wait, scuffling? Roughhousing? You mean like fledglings do when they are playing at fighting and hunting?" "I guess," James replied, having to think about that for a moment. He looked over at Sheeta for affirmation, but she just looked down with an aggrieved expression. "I promise. It was just a bit of harmless fun." James assured everyone once more, hoping to finally ease the tension. And it seemed to work. Pippa, who had slowly been coming closer again ever since James and Sheeta had stopped their little scuffle, carefully chimed in, "So you two are not going to fight anymore." James hopped off the table, taking Pippa by the arm and quickly guiding her back to her tray, while gently reassuring her, "No, of course not." "Right, Sheeta?" Sheeta scoffed at that, stating, "Yeah, no kidding. I'm sure if we actually fought, everyone would know. And these cowards probably wouldn't be around to stare anymore." Then she took a bite out of the fruit she had just been holding up until now, immediately grimacing at the taste. "You were right. I don't like it," she stated solemnly, throwing it back over to him, before also jumping off the table and silently walking towards the gate. "Hey, wait!" James yelled after her, quickly tossing the fruit on his tray before taking off after her, giving the people at his table a quick, apologetic look. The people parted, making way as James followed an irate Sheeta through the halls, insistently talking to her all the way, while she insisted on pretending he wasn't even there. "I know you can hear me," he firmly said, finally putting his hand on her shoulder in order to turn her towards him. Sheeta rotated, slapping his hand away mid-movement and letting out a loud, sharp hiss once she was facing him. Her face crumpled into a snarl, and her ears folded back, causing most of the crew members within earshot to make a hasty retreat. But James just lifted his other hand, pointing his finger directly at her face and sternly telling her, "Don't you hiss at me. I am trying to talk to you here." By now, it shouldn't have surprised Sheeta that her display would not work on him. But it did at least seem to take her out of his enough to calm down a bit. "And what would I want to talk to you about?" she asked, still antagonizing him, but at least not openly aggressive anymore. James took his hand down and folded his arms, putting on a disappointed expression. "Oh, I don't know," he suggested sarcastically. "Maybe why you just walked out on us like that." "Why would I? We've known each other for a day. I can damn well do as I please, without telling you a damn thing." She lashed out at him, forming a wide bow with her arms. "Of course you can do as you please. And if it was just that, I wouldn't have bothered. But that right now was not you just wanting to leave," he responded sternly. "And you know that, huh?" she asked, exasperated. "Because you know me so well, am I right?" James sighed, rubbing his temple. "Of course I don't. I'm not arrogant enough to think I know anything about you yet. Hell, you know way more about me than the other way around right now," he answered, forcing his voice to calm down. "But I don't have to know you to be able to tell that something is bothering you. And why do you care?" Sheeta asked him with a soft quiver in her voice. The air seemed to escape her body as she ever so slightly sank into herself. James once more extended his arm, placing it on her shoulder, which she allowed him to do this time. "You were right. I don't know you," he said gently. "But I want to get to know you. And honestly, I can't stand seeing people suffer in silence." She snorted softly. "What? Do you want to make me part of your pack?" she asked sarcastically. James smiled back at her. "If you want to," he replied. Then he looked around and calmly suggested, "You want to finish this talk in private? We appear to be in the way." Sheeta now looked around too, and promptly blushed slightly when she realized that by now a crowd had formed around them, staring at the drama in front of them from a safe distance. Right in front was a group of cadets whispering to each other, which Sheeta apparently saw as a great opportunity to let off some steam. "What's with you? You've got nothing to do? Think this is the common room?" She strictly barked at them while slowly walking towards them, causing them hastily get out of there before she could further tear into them. James laughed and shook his head at her, while she walked back over towards him, scaring the cadets, seemingly having lifted her spirits a bit. "Well, you are one to talk," he reprimanded while the two of them started after them. "I know. But they can't call me out on it," she snickered while keeping pace with him, folding her hands behind her head. They slowly walked through the corridors, ever so often quipping or bickering at each other. A quick joke here, a snarky comment there. James realized that unconsciously he had been leading them towards his laboratory. It was as good as any place to talk things out, he figured. But he couldn't imagine why it had been his default destination. He also began to think about what exactly he wanted to ask Sheeta as the door of his laboratory came into view. He, however, wouldn't figure it out. A Job for a Deathworlder, Chapter 5. A deafening sound suddenly filled the air as something caused all the walls and floor around them to shake violently, the shock wave reverberating seemingly throughout the entire ship, and almost taking the floor from under their feet. James could feel the material flex multiple centimeters, hoping to everything he held dear that it would hold. After the first impact was over, the ship immediately went into full danger mode. Lights turned a bright red and alarms blaring into their ears. There has been an explosion in the research wing. Please remain calm. The hull has not been breached, and no essential systems have been affected. Security is on their way. In the meantime, please evacuate the affected area. If there are colleagues in need near you, help them evacuate as well. I repeat, a calm message rang out through the intercoms. James looked around. Sheeta and himself had managed to stay on their feet during the detonation, but most people around them had not been as fortunate. Luckily, no one seemed seriously injured, and most of them had already started to get back up again. Sheeta was not looking around, instead opting to listening intently and sniffing the air. "That is the fire alarm," she calmly stated, looking down the corridor before them. And it sounded like that was close. Before James could respond, she was already taking off in the direction the sound had come from. "Wait!" James yelled after her and began to follow. "Aren't we supposed to evacuate? You are free to leave if you want to," she shouted back over her shoulder, without so much as slowing down. James had no intention of turning around, but he did have trouble keeping up with her. Many frightened crew members were running towards him, away from the supposed danger, making it hard to follow the agile woman, who was faster than him anyway. By now the air started to smell of smoke, even to him, and he could even see its source. It was only 2 labs over from his own. The massive metal door was bent outward, having been ripped open at the middle, where its 2 parts met, allowing thick, dark smoke to escape the room. Sheeta had stopped. She turned, seeing him approach, and immediately stated, "Something's not right. The computer should be extinguishing that fire by now." James looked at the heavy damage done to the door and suggested maybe the system was damaged. The explosion must have been massive. Then he looked around the corridors, sadly finding no signage nor something of the like. He whirled around Sheeta and asked, "You know the ship better than me? Is there some sort of fire extinguisher nearby?" "I'll get it. Wait here," Sheeta confirmed, and took off in the direction they had come from. While she was gone, James carefully moved towards the massive damaged door, peeking through the hole that had formed. The smoke was mostly confined to the ceiling and upper part of the laboratory, allowing him mostly clear vision inside the room. As he expected, it had been devastated. Parts of shattered furniture and electrical devices, as well as shards of glass littering the floor. The walls were charred and bent out of shape from the sheer force unleashed upon them. The fire raged on the right part of the room, slowly creeping across the floor. What was even burning? The metal. Wasn't that impossible? Suddenly, something caught his eye. Something moved behind a tipped-over workbench in the corner, furthest from the fire. At first, he thought it was just a dancing shadow cast by the flickering flames. Upon closer inspection, however, its edges were too clear, its movements too fluid, and not at all erratically. Someone was slowly rocking themselves in that corner. Could anyone in that room have survived such an explosion? Knowing that it was a terrible idea, James hoisted himself through the hole in the door, charging inside the room, trying to keep his head as far below the smoke as he possibly could. While nearing the figure, and with most of the alarms being blocked out by what remained of the door, he could hear them softly muttering to themselves. "No. This isn't what was supposed to happen. It's not possible. This doesn't make any sense at all." Their voice came to his ears, sounding oddly synthetic. "Hey, are you all right? Can you walk? We have to get out of here," James shouted over the alarms and the roaring of the ever closer coming flames. He could feel the hot air wafting over him, the heat growing more intense with each passing moment. Maybe it's... No, that's not right at all. But then how did it? The mumbling continued. James stepped closer, now being able to look over the table at the figure. Their body was sleek and black as the void, the only features he could make out being what looked like two large red compound eyes, seemingly eerily glowing in the fire's shine. The body was round and segmented like an insect's pupa, a head in the front more suggested than actually there, with 4 short appendages coming from the front of the large, lower segment, and 6 more, way larger ones protruding from the back, looking like gigantic crustacean-like legs. With their forward arms, they were holding their head, while rocking themselves back and forth with the large backwards ones, keeping themselves suspended a few centimeters above the ground, hoping to snap them out of whatever was happening with them. James reached out to them. Once his hand had made contact with one of the large legs, he realized that he was touching metal. The person, however, seemed to still feel his touch and whirled around, swatting his hand away with another of their large appendages. No. I have to figure it out. This cannot have happened. They yelled frantically. James looked over at the flames, looming menacingly over him and the distressed person. Listen, we don't have time. We have to leave now, James shouted at them. He thought about whether or not he could just grab them and carry them out. On the other hand, he didn't want to get too closely acquainted with the heavy metal claws on the end of their legs. A yell from behind him ripped him from his thoughts. James! Someone was calling out to him. It was Shida. I'm in here. He yelled back. What? Are you crazy? Shida cried out, her face appearing at the hole in the door only a moment later. Then she told him, Listen, you have to get out of there. Something's not right with that fire. We'll have to blast that entire room. And you don't want to be in there when that happens. Someone's still in here. James yelled back at her. I have to get them out first. What? But how? Shida blurted out, before shaking her head and ordering anyway, hurry up with it. We can't wait much longer, or the damage could actually start afflicting the hull. The alarms were still blaring. The smoke made it hard to breathe, and the heat of the fire practically crushed his face. And in front of him, there was still that muttering. It is impossible. It doesn't make sense. I have to figure it out. James braced himself against the sheer sensory overload around him, taking a deep breath despite the smoke and closing his eyes. As good as he could, he calmed himself down completely. Feeling the adrenaline pump through his veins. He tried to bring himself at least momentarily into a state of tranquility. Once his hands and knees had stopped shaking, he opened his eyes back up again and slowly stepped over the table, placing himself right in front of the small figure and reaching his open hand out, placing it right within their vision. Slowly, the figure followed his arm with their vision until they looked up to his face, despite the rational part of his brain telling him not to. He gave them an honest, gentle smile. Then he gently but firmly said, We'll figure it out. But for now, you'll have to take my hand, all right? If we don't make it out of here, we'll never figure it out. So we have to leave. Just take my hand. He did not know if their red eyes could actually see him, as they gave no indication of their focus, but they stayed firmly aimed at his face for a few moments. "You have very sharp teeth," they suddenly stated, the synthetic voice ringing out from them seemingly without a source. Then they softly reached out too, grabbing his hand with the hands of their short arms, allowing him to pull him out of the corner and over the table. Their metal legs scuttled quickly along the floor as he pulled them along the room and effortlessly lifted them through the hole in the door. After they were through, Sheeta quickly helped James slip out of the room himself, pulling him through the crack. Right as he was out, a security team that had apparently been at the ready quickly jammed a large hose attached to some big machine to the hole and blasted something inside that James could not see from his position. By now, the ship's ventilation had begun clearing the smoke out of the corridor, so James could take some deep, clear breaths as he collapsed onto his back in front of the destroyed laboratory. Almost in an instant, Sheeta stood over him. "What were you thinking? I don't care how hardy you are. You could easily have died in there," she yelled down at him. "Yeah, I know. That was too close. Even for me," James answered, breathing heavily and coughing every few words. "But at least we got everyone out safely." Sheeta looked down at him disapprovingly, but did not further lay into him for the moment, instead looking around, saying, "Speaking of which, who exactly did you get out of there? And more importantly, where did they go?" James propped himself up, looking around. He couldn't find the small black figure among the people in the hallway. But without any people walking about, he could see much further along the corridor than usual, just making out the small figure sitting far down the empty hall. He pointed in the direction. Sheeta followed his direction, squinting while trying to see what he meant, but apparently coming up short. James began to struggle to his feet, Sheeta quickly rushing over to help him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Come, we should talk to them." And he began making his way towards the cowering form. Once they had come a good bit closer, Sheeta began to also make them out at their destination, looking very unsure of what she was seeing. James, too, did not know who or even what they were dealing with. The small person, only about the size of a toddler, not counting their giant backside legs, and entirely either clad in or made of a jet black metal, sat in the middle of the hallway, the floor of which had been replaced by a giant window, the very same where James and Sheeta had first met only a few days prior. Only a few days prior? They suspended themselves a meter above the ground on their long legs, gazing downwards into the void with their large red eyes, while folding their shorter forwards arms and legs. Sheeta and James shot each other a glance before stepping onto the window themselves. James slowly sat next to them, his lungs still aching from the strain, signaling for Sheeta to do the same. She obliged with a shrug, sinking down right next to him. For some time, they simply gazed down into the void together with their new acquaintance. Suddenly, a strange machine-like voice rang out next to him, calmly stating, "You can look at it, too. It helps me calm down. Most people don't like looking at it. They say it unnerves them." "You mean space? It is quite mesmerizing, isn't it?" James answered calmly, before looking over at them, studying their matte surface. Sheeta was looking over his shoulder, seemingly enraptured by the strange appearance of the person sitting with them, while also appearing more than unnerved. Finally, they were taking their eyes off the window and looking back at James instead. "I think I am supposed to thank you for helping me. Is that right?" they asked, the metal shell acting as their face, staying completely unmoving. James was a bit taken aback. You don't have to if you don't want to, he answered abashed, laughing awkwardly. Usually, you would thank people for things that you are thankful for. Sheeta gave him a perplexed side glance, seemingly questioning both of their sanity. The metal body shifted a bit, possibly changing the angle at which they were viewing his face. It remained in that position, silently, for a few moments. Thank you for staying for me, they said, finally breaking the silence. You are welcome, James replied brightly, even though their wording did confuse him a bit. You probably wouldn't have been able to keep him from doing it, even if you tried, Sheeta remarked from behind him, looking at him impishly. You are right. I could not, they replied cluelessly, although I did not try very hard. Sheeta's playful expression disappeared and made way for one of disbelief. Wait, did you seriously? She started, but James hastily held her back. He quickly cut in. It really wasn't any trouble, don't worry, letting out a big fake laugh in the process. Sheeta looked annoyed at his behavior.